What are the properties of multiplication? Think about this question during the lesson. Look at the picture of beach balls. Do 2 groups of 5 beach balls equal 5 groups of 2 beach balls? Yes, 2 groups of 5 beach balls are equal to 5 groups of 2 beach balls. Let's look at the first property of multiplication. Commutative property of multiplication. The order of the factors can be changed, but the product stays the same. 2 groups of 5 balls is 10 balls. 5 groups of 2 balls is 10 balls. The next property of multiplication involves grouping of factors. Associative property of multiplication. You can change the grouping of factors. The product stays the same. What is another way of stating the associative property of multiplication? If you have 3 factors, you can multiply either the first 2 or the last 2 factors first. Which property tells you that 5 multiplied by 1 equals 5? The identity property of multiplication tells you that 5 multiplied by 1 equals 5. Identity property of multiplication. When you multiply any number by 1, the product is that number. 5 groups of 1 ball is 5 balls. The last property of multiplication involves the use of 0. Zero property of multiplication. When you multiply any number by 0, the product is 0. 5 groups of 0 balls is 0. Does it matter how large a number you multiply by 0 is? No. Increasing the size of the number never changes the result of multiplying it by 0. What are the 4 properties of multiplication? The 4 properties of multiplication are: commutative property of multiplication, associative property of multiplication, identity property of multiplication, zero property of multiplication.
Today we're going to review Unit 2, Lesson 1. Now, Unit 2, Lesson 1 is pretty straightforward. Basically, the whole lesson takes you through some basic properties of multiplication. In Unit 2, we're going to start multiplying. So today we're going to start by taking a look at some definitions or some properties that will help you when you are multiplying. Now, the first property, and there are 4 of them, the first property is called the commutative property of multiplication. So the commutative property of multiplication basically just says that the order of the factors, and remember factors are numbers that you're multiplying together, so 2 times 4, 2 and 4 would be your factors. So the order of the factors can be changed, but the product, the answer, will remain the same. And a little trick that I like to use to remember that is that it doesn't matter in which order the factors communicate, the product stays the same. And the word communicate is similar to the word commutative. So that's kind of the little trick that I use to remember what the commutative property of multiplication says. It doesn't make a difference in what order you list the factors, the answer is going to be the same. Let's take a look at an example of that. For instance, I could do 2 times 4. 2 times 4, we know, equals 8. Well, I could switch my factors around and do 4 times 2, and that still equals 8. So it doesn't make a difference which one comes first. They both have the same answer. Let's take a look at that if we're multiplying 3 numbers together. So if I do 3 times 2 times 1, 3 times 2 equals 6, and 6 times 1 equals 6. What if I switch those numbers around and do 1 times 2 times 3? Still keeping the same numbers, I'm just switching the order. 1 times 2 is 2, 2 times 3 is 6. I can try it one last time. I could do 2 times 1 times 3. Again, I'm still keeping the same exact factors. I'm just changing the order in which they communicate with each other. 2 times 1 is 2. 2 times 3 is 6. So it doesn't make a difference in what order the factors are listed. Your product, the answer to a multiplication problem, is always going to stay the same. That's the commutative property of multiplication. Now, let's take a look at the second property. This property is called the associative property of multiplication. For this property, it says you can change the grouping of the factors and the product will stay the same. So if we group them using parentheses, it doesn't make a difference how we group them, the product will stay the same. And the trick I use to remember this one is that it doesn't make a difference which group a factor associates with, the answer stays the same. And remember, associate with means like who you hang out with. So it doesn't make a difference which group a factor hangs out with, the answer still stays the same. And an example I can use of that is if I say, in parentheses, 3 times 4 times 2. We know that we always do what's in the parentheses first. Parentheses are very important, so we're always going to do the parentheses first. So 3 times 4, that equals 12, and 12 times 2, that equals 24. If I switch the group, so if I switch what's in the parentheses here, and if I do 2, same numbers, 2, I'm still using 2, 3, and 4, but just in a different order. So if I do 2 times 3, that gives me 6. 6 times 4 equals 24. I can switch them again. I can do, still using 2, 3, and 4, 2 times 4 are hanging out in a group, and 3 is out here hanging out by himself. 2 times 4 equals 8. 8 times 3 equals 24. So the associative property of multiplication says it doesn't make a difference how you group your numbers, the product will always be the same. Doesn't make a difference which group the factor hangs out with, the answer will always be the same. All right, let's move on to the third. The third identity, or the third property of multiplication is an easy one. It's called the identity property of multiplication. This basically says when you multiply any number by 1, the product is that number. And the trick I use is when you multiply a number by 1, it keeps its identity. That's how you know it's the identity property. For instance, if I multiply 7 times 1, that equals 7. If you multiply 2,000 times 1, it equals 2,000. Any number multiplied by 1 equals itself. If you think about it like this, if I bake 2,000 cookies one time, I have 2,000 cookies. If I bake 7 cookies just one time, I'm going to have 7 cookies. I could have 4,725,936.27 cookies multiplied by 1 equals that number. Every single number multiplied by 1 equals itself. It keeps its identity. You're only using that number one time, so it doesn't change. That's a super easy one. And last but not least, we have the zero property of multiplication. This is the easiest to remember. It says when you multiply a number by 0, the product, the answer, is 0. So when you use a number 0 times, it equals nothing, or 0. That's how I remember it. Think of it this way. If I'm baking 7 cookies, but I never bake them, you're not going to have any cookies. So 7 times 0 equals nothing. If I make 17 pizzas, but I never bake them, I'm not going to have any pizzas. If I make 4,829.6742 pizzas, and I never make them, I have nothing. Any number, no matter how big or small, any number times 0 equals 0. If you're using it never, you have nothing. So anything times 0 equals 0. Those are the 4 different properties that you need for multiplication. Take a second to review them and make sure that you remember which one's which, and they're going to help you as we continue moving forward through this unit where we practice our multiplication facts. Don't forget to practice your multiplication facts for at least 5 to 10 minutes every single day so that you can become a master multiplier. Awesome job!